fact, when Pastor said that there's a calling, you get a call. I think when it came to me, there was a wrong number because I've never felt that I was really worthy and had the ability to come up here. So with that, I come before you. As Pastor and had mentioned, uh, maybe it's been about over a year now that Pastor Billy and Laura had asked me to stand up here to share about myself and present a message. But I always told them, you know, uh, I'm not worthy of that. I don't have the training, I don't have the education, and certainly, uh, it's really not a good time. I'm busy, and eventually I forgot all about it. But they never did. And sure, over time we would revisit the topic, but really, and finally, a few weeks ago, I agreed to do it. But there's another side to this. The real part of it is that I made a deal with God uh, that I would present a message to you here in church if He would restore some funding. As you know, Lindy and I are in business, and we lost some of that business a while ago. So, but in fact, specifically in May, and you know what? As of Friday, this past Friday, He restored that funding. So God is good. So here I am. I know that sort of deal is wrong for a Christian. In fact, that's what I would think, if I was sitting out there. But as you'll see from my message, I still feel I'm unworthy. And I am here before you only by God's grace. Pastor and Laura suggested to speak about my life as it relates to chapter 22, Jesus and the three prodigals. Out of the book, Jesus Revolution, in fact, I'm sure most of you have it, and it relates to the prodigals. In fact, in this case, three prodigals, which I'll get into in a little while. But before I begin, I'd like to share a little bit about myself. I think some of you may know me, and we're one of the founding families of the predecessor Southgate Ministries, and before that, Elam Full Gospel here when it moved to Waterville. But many of you have joined us since then, and some of you may not know who I am. So I'd like to share a little bit about that. And as you'll see from that I wasn't a worthy guy. But let me begin by saying that my parents were born in Puerto Rico. I think most of you know that we're of Puerto Rican descent, but my folks actually met in New York City, and they married Christmas Eve, 1952. And I was born in the Bronx and raised as an American of Puerto Rican descent. That's how we identify ourselves. Spanish is my first language. I learned it in school. English, in school. And I grew up Roman Catholic, as most Puerto Ricans and certainly folks from Latin America, we at least start out as Catholics, and that's what happened traditionally in our home. And later on, things changed, and I think we are here today because of that. Now, the home in which I was raised was very dysfunctional. Mom was verbally and physically abusive, and Dad was a Marine, and he never raised a hand against us or against Mom. Mom was the one that instilled discipline, and to this day, I always wondered why he held himself back with knowing what a Marine is and what he is capable of. He never lifted a finger against her nor the kids. But Mom dreamed of having a priest in the family. So at the age of 13, she sent me off to seminary to study for the priesthood. But and which was really my first year of high school, so you can imagine. But I got sick, so I had to return to New York City, and I completed my high school at an all-boys Catholic high school. And And through God's grace, here we go. Now, God's grace will be throughout this message. Uh, in my senior year of high school, I met my future bride, Lindy. And that was on June 2nd, 1972. And she was 15 and I was 17. So just to give you an idea of high school sweethearts, we really are. And then 6 years, 5 months, and 2 days after we met, we married, November 4th, 1978. So, but, you know, growing up as Catholics and not really practicing it, I think the party life was more important to us. You know, we were dancers, you know, big dancers. We would go out on Friday, Saturday, and Sundays to dance, and the booze and the drugs. And it wasn't heavy drugs, but certainly we did and use some of the drugs that we certainly regret today. And but out of that marriage has come two beautiful children, and both of them I think you know, but certainly Christina and Christopher, our son, who lives in Syracuse. But through God's grace, once again, we chose those names, and I don't know exactly how it all came about, but the name Christina and Christopher actually I think comes from the Greek or Latin, which means Christ bearer or follower of Christ. You know, so these are things that even though we really weren't Christian, you know, practicing any type of faith, we came up with those names, and I always wondered back, you know, what was the influence? And of course, you know, God's grace. I had several jobs throughout our marriage, and one eventually brought us here to Utica, New York. I went to work for an insurance company that's based out of here, and I traveled the Northeast and eventually the country as part of an audit team, and took that job rather young for the level it was at, because most of my peers at the office in the home office were in their 50s, early 60s, and I was 32 at the time. So it offered me an opportunity to do some traveling and certainly get to see some of the country, and to do a job that really was sometimes beyond my capabilities, but God was there. And the most important thing about working at Utica National was through God's grace, Lindy and I met Ken and Lynn Gannett, who brought us to the Lord. And in fact, we were baptized in August of 1989, having moved up here in 1986. But right after that, and certainly as 3 years into working for Utica National, I went to work for another company based out of San Diego, but they needed somebody here in the northeast part of the country. And that's really where my prodigal journey began. For 10 years, I worked for this outfit, and I started working for them in the Northeast. And I started out as a trainer, and my job was to take men that were experienced adjusters, you know, the ones, if you get into a car accident, someone has to write the estimate. Well, back then, everybody used a piece of paper and pencil. And what I was tasked to do was to train these men that had never used a computer, never used any technology, to train them on a new portable data entry device. And if they didn't learn after the class, if they failed the class, they would lose their jobs. And because of the training and some of the fun that we had, it turned out that everybody passed. And I received accolades throughout the several insurance companies. They were very pleased that they were able to take these very experienced adjusters and turn them over into this new technology. Well, I worked my way up through the ranks of this company, and eventually, through God's grace, I became a director of their international division and traveling throughout Latin America. I traveled throughout 13 countries, establishing representatives in those areas, but there were some things that certainly came out of that. The business division grew 170% when I took over, after I took over. And these were big financial insurance companies and financial banks. In fact, most of these countries, they're run by 4 or 5 families. And I got to meet many of the families that ran these countries through the job that I did. I traveled as a VIP. I traveled with senior company executives that accompanied me from my company. We had bodyguards, limousines, and first-class service everywhere we went. That's how we were treated, especially in the times that you may remember. There was a lot of kidnappings going on with U.S. businessmen in that region. And so therefore there was a lot of things that were, in fact, some of this I'm saying that my family didn't even know, especially the kids, because it was just something that we had to do. I stayed at four-star hotels, ate at the best meals, exclusive sightseeing, and certainly late night entertainment was a part of the deal. In 1997, in fact, I did such a great job for this company that I received the accolades of Salesman and Employee of the Year. But the one thing I always remember about that was not the reward or the awards, is the fact that I had to stand up there alone without a family. That was part of the deal. That family wasn't a part of a lot of the times that I experienced in these 10 years. I did them alone. And according to the kids during that time, in fact, Christopher and Christina always say that's when we were rich. We had all these. I took them on these trips. They stayed at hotels, ordered room service, and certainly. And throughout this though, one of the things is certainly there were dangers that came into play anytime you travel internationally, and certainly when you travel, tragedies were averted. For example, I had a $5 million insurance policy for ransom, kidnapping. Training for kidnap awareness and avoidance. That was a special class and training that we had to go through when we travel. I flew over 3 million miles. And once again, God's grace. I think about some of the things that the family, most of these, they never knew, is that I experienced aborted takeoffs, airport runway blackouts during severe storms. So, the plane is landing and the pilot can't see where he or she is landing. And the most interesting one was I was in a small plane, a commuter plane, flying into New York, and we averted a mid-air collision over the World Trade Center in New York City. So that was, just some of the things that I recall. There were several others, but those are the ones that I remember. But the worst experience, certainly, and God, I knew was there because we almost traveled with this man to his home. In Colombia, we had met with a insurance company executive in Medellin. And after the meal at the restaurant, we decided to go back to the hotel. It was getting a little late, and so he decided just to go home. But he had invited us to his home to see some of the artwork and some of the things that he had. Well, sure enough, that night he was assassinated. He had been involved in some of the levels that, as you can imagine, in that country and many other of these families were targets of crime and for many reasons. And in this case, he was assassinated for not working with the cartel. He refused to provide them cars that the insurance company had recovered through their office. But the worst part of this time was that my family was the one that suffered the most. I was never home for Lindy and the kids. I was not a good man, husband, or a father. I was a Christian in name only during that time. Actually, Lindy should have left me for physical and emotional neglect, and I often ask myself why she didn't. But then I lost my job, and though it took a while, I got my family back. Through it all, God's grace was there. In fact, it was always there. And this morning, it's funny, as I'm going through the notes and writing this and reading the chapter in the book, something came to light this morning that I didn't write about the good things that have happened since I've been home, and certainly, so that's what I was putting some finishing. That's why we were late this morning, because the ink in the printer died, it dried up, So I had to change the printer. It's a new printer, so I couldn't figure out how to put the ink in. The paper got jammed. And then sure enough, Lindy's saying, hey, we got to get to church. We get into an argument and saying, but this is, I said to myself at that point, I said to Lindy, I said, this is the devil trying to get at me, because what I wanted to say, because of God's grace and bringing me home, is that it helped me set up a shop at home and a business at home. First of all, with a brother who still worked in Wall Street, and we worked in helping recruit technologists for Wall Street. And that became something that I thought I could never do. But because of my knowledge and some of the things that I had done in technology with the company I was with, I was allowed to do that for a while. God's grace was there. In spite of the fact that I still feel to this day unworthy of some of that. An opportunity to work with Lindy to set up several businesses to help kids in need and those in trouble through the court system. That's something else that we've been able to do, and I've been able to do since I've come home. Volunteer in the community. This is big for me. In fact, I was raised to give back to your community, and that's something that certainly has been allowed because I'm home now, and I have my own hours, and I set up my time. And I help make a difference for its underserved members of our community. And finally, after all these years, to finally work at something I really enjoy and stay home with Lindy. That's really, I'm amazed that I'm still able to do and earn a living and contribute and certainly participate and do this at a time that, when folks think about retirement, I'm doing some of the best things and some of the things I really enjoy that I've ever enjoyed, and better than, traveling and, the world travel and all that. And most importantly, and this is really, when I share this with my peers, I'm able to put my grandkids on the bus every morning. That is such a gift for me. And when I share this with my peers and they tell me that they've got to travel to California and Florida and Ohio and Minnesota and Michigan to go see their grandkids, and I share with them, hey, listen, I can see my kids, my grandkids every day. It's a blessing. It really is. And for Lindy and myself, it's, they are just a big part of our family, and certainly a blessing, God's grace. Now, let's talk about prodigal. What does the word prodigal mean? In fact, that's one of the things that, you hear the parable, you're very familiar with it, but it's something that I thought I knew. But in reality, I didn't realize that what the term means or meant. So let me read a little bit out of the chapter that Pastor Billy wrote in the Three Prodigals from the Jesus Revolution book, number 1. When we do not deserve any goodness at all, he showers goodness on us. When we deserve the worst, he gave us his best. We see this in the most beautiful parable in the Bible, the parable of the two prodigal sons and their prodigal father. I thought that was kind of maybe a mistake. Prodigal father, he didn't run away. Well, sure enough, it doesn't mean that. Prodigal means extravagant, lavish. The parable was told to the Pharisees, but the sinners, we were called sinners, or they were called sinners, because Jesus had not died for them yet. They got to hear it as well, and it is much more than a beautiful parable. It is about Jesus, and it is about his relationship with us. Xander, if you could put up, I know that you started, I think, Isaiah 55. I'd like to read from one of the verses that Pastor puts in the chapter regarding the prodigal and God's grace. The Lord says, my thoughts and my ways are not like yours. Just as the heavens are higher than the earth, my thoughts and my ways are higher than yours. Rain and snow fall from the sky, but they don't return without watering the earth that produces seeds to plant and grain for us to eat. That's how it is with my words. They don't return to me without doing everything I send them to do. God's people will celebrate. Now, what's up here and what I'm saying may be a little different because I use a contemporary English version, and King James, I believe, is what you see before you. When you are set free, you will celebrate. When you are set free, you will celebrate and travel home in peace. Mountains and hills will sing as you pass by, and the trees will clap. Zandria, if you could also now put up the Luke 15, 25 through 32. Thank you. Wow, that was fast. The older son had been out in the field. In fact, in this chapter, this is where the three prodigals are highlighted, and the term lavish and extravagant, maybe some of that will certainly filter through, but this is the perspective of the older son, who was a prodigal, and in today's day and age, and even as Pastor wrote in the chapter as he ended it, there's a lot more meaning now as I read this by how Pastor Billy wrote as in the finishing paragraph. And let me just read. In verse 25, the older son had been out in the field, but when he came near the house, he heard the music and dancing. So he called out to one of the servants and he said, hey, what's going on here? Well, the servant answered, your brother has come home safe and sound, and your father ordered us to kill the best calf. The older brother got angry that he wouldn't, got angry, and so that he would not even go into the house. In other words, he got ticked off and said, I don't want any of this. His father came out and said, hey, come on inside. Let's share. But he said to his father, listen, for years I've been here. I've worked with you. I've worked like a slave and have always obeyed you. But you have never even given me a little goat so that I could give a dinner for my friends. This other son of yours wastes his time and money on prostitutes and other things and now he has come home, and now that he's come home, you ordered the best calf to be killed for a feast? His father replied, my son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we should be glad and celebrate, for your brother was dead, but now he is alive. He was lost, and now has been found. Now, from that parable, there's three things I certainly now, especially after doing this research and reading, and things I was oblivious to in all the times that I've heard it previously, is the fact that, the real true hero in this story is the father. And who does this father represent? In your mind, who does he represent? The story centers on the father, on the response of the father, rather than the actions of the sons. I must be more like the father than behave like the sons. And that's really one of the things that I certainly have gotten out of this. God's grace has shown me that as unworthy as I feel and certainly believe that I can be anything near what God does, I certainly can believe that through his grace I can. I now see myself as a son of a good and generous God who is ready to accept me the way I am. And even when I pray, I don't pray thinking, hey, I'm undeserving. And, I still, say that it's unwarranted and certainly, but I really believe and I see now that he accepts me the way I am. And the parable is the final of three stories that Jesus uses to show how to respond to those who were lost and are now found. Not only should our response be acceptance, but it should also encompass complete joy for what God has done for us. So, as I end my message today, I'll change up Pastor Billy's introduction to chapter 22 into the form of a prayer, and my prayer now, to thank God for his grace. God has been very unfair to me. He has been unfairly good to me. When I did not deserve any goodness at all, he showered goodness on me. When I deserved the worst, he gave me his best at a time I was the most unworthy. Amen.